Progressive era was a time period where a lot of change happened with regard to how the government reacted to problems within the nation, and it was just a reflection of kind of the reform attitudes of the time. So progressivism, just to put it in context, was a fragmented effort. There was no progressive committee, a nationwide group of progressives that said, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to implement progressive reform. It was just happening in different places throughout the country, and really it was many different kinds of progressive policies and progressive initiatives that were happening, independent of each other. But their common cause, and they all had a common cause, even though they may not have discussed it, and it was to address the economic and social problems caused by the Industrial Revolution and the urbanization of America. And if you remember the last unit, we talked quite a bit about this, about the problems that arose with, all the new industries and the Industrial Revolution, the workplace issues, the immigration issues, the child labor issues, and then the urbanization of America, the problems within the cities with regard to adequate housing, sewage, plumbing, litter, disease, water. All these problems were coming to the forefront because of the very quick increasing populations of the cities to feed workers into the Industrial Revolution. So the main features of progressivism, what was included in the progressive era, or the promotion of progressivism: greater democracy, including direct primaries, initiative, referendum, recall, and popular election of senators. Direct primaries, basically a primary is where voters choose which member of a political party would run in the general election against the other political candidate from the other party. So each party has their own primary election, where Democrats would go vote, decide which Democrat would run for, would be their candidate for president, or which Democrat would be their candidate for governor, and the Republicans would have their separate election, their separate primary election, where they would decide, which candidate would oppose the Democrat for governor or for the presidency. But this was something new during progressivism, the people choosing members of the political party or candidates within the political party. Prior to this, it was done by the elites of the party. If you kind of imagine a back room filled with smoke and, powerful people drinking scotch and deciding, okay, we want this person to run for president as a Republican, and that's generally how it was. But because of the disconnect between government and what they were doing, especially with the corruption, and the people, this idea of the people becoming more involved in politics, the people being more involved in the democracy, manifested itself in these direct primaries that changed from the backroom deals to the people voting who among the political party candidates would run for office. Also, an initiative, which was a progressive electoral reform, where the people could, the masses or the population of the citizenry could garner enough signatures in a petition to get a policy initiative on the ballot. Okay, so it's instead of the traditional way of the legislators or Congress, the state legislators deciding what to vote on, the people decided through a petition what to vote on. A referendum is kind of the flip of that, where the legislature, the state legislature, would submit a policy or a potential law to the public to vote on. Instead of the legislature voting on the law, then the public would vote on it. And then a recall election. The recall elections are elections that potentially bring elected officials up for re-election before the next scheduled election. So let's say you've elected a governor in your state who just won his election, and he won't be up for re-election until for 4 more years. Well, then you find out though that he's incompetent or he's a criminal or whatever, and you want to get rid of this person. Well, you could have a recall election where it's basically if you get enough signatures in a petition, you can schedule a new election before the next scheduled election. You could have an election after 1 year or 2 years or however long in order to remove that person, or at least run people against him. And then popular election of senators. According to the original Constitution, U.S. Constitution, the U.S. senators, 2 from each state, of course, were chosen by the state legislatures. So for Texas, the state legislature in Austin would choose who our U.S. senators would be. Well, in order to have greater democracy and have the citizens more involved in the democratic process, popular election of senators basically means just that the public would vote, just as they vote for their members of the House of Representatives, they now also vote for their U.S. senators. Also, another feature of progressivism was the gospel of efficiency. The gospel of efficiency. And a lot of it is based in the Principles of Scientific Management written by Frederick W. Taylor. And this is an idea that, or the concept that politicians, those that are elected, just because they're elected to an office doesn't mean they're qualified to make policy regarding very specific policy areas like education, like urban planning, like park development. So basically, the gospel of efficiency states that what you should do is you should have professionals, people that are experts in this area, being appointed to make policy. So instead of an elected official making education policy for a state, the legislature or the governor or those elected officials would appoint a commission to, which is a group of people of experts, of education experts, teachers, administrators, things like that, to develop policy. And this was really implemented statewide for the first time in almost every aspect of government in Wisconsin. It was called, therefore, the Wisconsin idea. Also, another feature of progressivism, corporate regulation. We've been kind of touching on this throughout this unit, this issue of corporations, especially corporations in large industries like railroads, coal, steel, that were becoming so powerful that the local governments were having a lot of difficulty, holding them accountable for the things they were doing within their states. So you see a trend towards more regulation, specifically on the national level, where the national government would begin regulating these huge corporations and busting up these monopolies and trusts, these large corporations that have reach throughout the United States. Also, social justice. This was part of progressivism. One of the problems with the Industrial Revolution and the flood of people moving into the cities was just social problems, things like child labor, women's rights. Child labor laws were rare, and even if they were on the books in some states, they were rarely enforced. Women had very few rights, political rights, social rights, and so you start seeing a push towards ensuring women having especially political rights. And really the big goal of the women's rights movement during the progressive era is getting women the right to vote, which some states had already provided women the right to vote by the early 1900s, the first being Wyoming, which gave women the right to vote in 1869. Also, prohibition, outlawing alcohol. Many of these progressive reformists saw alcohol as a fundamental reason why immigrants especially couldn't get ahead. People were spending their money on alcohol, and it took away their motivation to work. And all of these things issues with children, women's rights, immigrant help, helping them assimilate, helping them learn American values and mores. A lot of this became prevalent in what would be called settlement houses. And settlement houses were established usually by, upper middle class women who were reform minded, who wanted to help their communities, and basically they were established to provide assistance to especially immigrants who were trying to, assimilate, find their way, find jobs. Most famous of which was Jane Addams' Hull House, I believe in Chicago. And in general, progressivism can be defined as, and this is probably the most succinct kind of definition or way to describe progressivism, is to have government functioning as a public service. Because you have this government that has power to make laws. And so progressives would argue that you should use this power to help people and to, to help improve the status of the citizenry through, child labor laws, women's rights, and greater democracy, and all of these things. Now, as far as government policy, that was one aspect of progressivism. Now, another aspect was business, and basically progressivism is an idea that basically at its root is try to treat people more equally, give people opportunities, and help them remove them from their suffering or their problems. And some people look to business to kind of also adhere to these principles, and it was called the social gospel. And so basically, the progressivism is kind of underlying is treat your fellow man as you would want to be treated. Do unto others. Well, some argue that businesses should do the same thing. If you're going to pretend, they would say, to be a good person who cares about others, well, have your business policies reflect that. So if you see that an example would be, so if a business sees that their very low wages that they're paying causes a family to not be able to feed their children, well, raise the wages. That is that's your social responsibility to do that, to ensure, just like you would assist your neighbor if their children were hungry. Well, if you own a business, you should treat these people the same way. And so basically, you're talking about social programs. You're talking about businesses being regulated and government playing more of a role. And a lot of this also, a lot of progressivism was the idea that we needed to get rid of the corruption. We needed to get rid of the elite deals between government and business, whereby government businesses could do anything and everything they wanted to their employees because government would allow it. And there were what we might call today investigative journalists at the time. At the time, they were called muckrakers, basically people who worked for usually newspapers or magazines that would kind of investigate and write about instances of corruption within government or instances of corruption and wrongdoing within business. And they exposed a lot of the problems within the progressive era or within the Industrial Revolution that led to the progressive reform. It's just looks like a painting of a women's rights movement. Joined the National Women's Suffrage Association. Suffrage meaning the right to vote. So as you can see, it's all women. Here's a great photograph of a young girl working in a textile factory. I believe earlier in the semester I showed you a photo of a group of boys that worked in coal mines. Well, this is kind of the equivalent for a girl, probably 10 or 11, maybe 12 years old at the most, working full time because there were no real enforceable child labor laws. So let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, who was really the first progressive president. Roosevelt, in his first term, he made it clear that he believed in corporate regulation. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves and try to make him out to be some kind of socialist or communist. He was a true believer in the free market and capitalism. But what he didn't believe in, and what he thought was harmful to the free market and capitalism, was completely unregulated corporations, especially ones that were dominating or monopolizing their industries. He said it's anti-capitalism, because capitalism, free market, is based on competition. And if you have industries and or corporations that are so powerful that there is no competition, well, that's not capitalism, according to Roosevelt. So he promoted and initiated many things that tried to limit the power of huge corporations, including the very first dissolution of a business by court order, which was the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad company who the courts had decided had become too powerful and were monopolizing railroad routes. Also, Roosevelt was a pragmatist. He always wanted solutions. He really didn't care, which side he offended or how the solution came about. He just wanted solutions. And a good example of that was the coal strike of 1902. The coal miner union was trying to negotiate a new contract with the coal mine owners during the summer of 1902. And when the mine owners didn't bargain in good faith and wouldn't come to the table to negotiate, the coal miners threatened to go on strike. Of course, if you're striking and not digging coal in the summer, then there will likely be no coal for heat in the Northeast in the winter, which is just a few months away. So President Roosevelt saw this as a real problem. And so he wanted to make sure that the people of the Northeast, especially in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, those major cities, had coal for heat in the winter. He basically forced the two parties in this coal strike to the table. And he did it in a very Roosevelt way. He basically went to the coal mining companies and told them, if you don't come to the table and negotiate with the union in good faith, I will nationalize the coal mines, which means the government will take them over, and I will send in the army to dig coal. And you will lose your coal mines and lose all your profits. And then he went to the coal miners, the workers, the union, and said, if you don't come to the table and negotiate in good faith and compromise, I will draft all of you into the army. And so this brought them together, and a deal was done. A negotiated settlement did occur. And of course, Roosevelt, this wasn't all he did. There were 25 more trust-busting cases where he broke up huge monopolies. And then, of course, the Elkins Act, which outlawed railroad rebates. One of the things that the railroads were accused of early on that later became illegal was charging lower rates to companies that shipped more goods on their rails. So in order to, let's say, John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil was shipping a lot of oil on the railroads, and there were competition among the railroads for his shipments. Well, what would happen is a railroad line or a railroad company would offer lower rates just to Rockefeller, but charge everybody else a higher rate, and that became illegal. So instead of doing that, the railroads began just at the end of the year basically reimbursing these companies for using their railroads, and it was called rebating. They were giving them rebates. Well, and this was just a way to subvert the initial law. Well, the Elkins Act made that illegal as well. Now, Roosevelt's second term, the election of 1904, he won easily. He was very popular. Of course, that was his first election. Remember, he became president in 1900 after McKinley was assassinated. And during the second term, the Hepburn Act was passed, which basically gave the interstate Commerce Commission the power to set maximum railroad rates. If you remember last unit, that was one of the great complaints of the farmers, was that they were being price gouged with very high railroad rates to offset the losses that the railroads were incurring in the more urban areas where there was more railroad competition. Also, during Roosevelt's second term, a young muckraker by the name of Upton Sinclair decided he was going to write about the working conditions in the meatpacking plants in Chicago. And he went into the meatpacking plants in Chicago and kind of snooped around. I'm not sure if he actually worked there or not, but he wrote a book, and it was called The Jungle. And it basically highlighted the terrible, dangerous working conditions of the meatpacking plants. Also, the book highlighted the quality of the meat that was being produced, where rats and body parts and all kinds of things would end up in the meat, the ground meat or whatever, and without any labeling, or you would think that, you would hope that if rats or other things fell into the meat, that it would be stopped and removed, but Sinclair observed this to not be the case. So he wrote a book about it. It was very popular. And supposedly Teddy Roosevelt read it, and he was not happy. So he told his some of those who worked for him to go check this out and see if it was true. And they came back and they told him, yes, this is true. What Sinclair wrote was actually true. So being the can-do president he is, he pushed through Congress laws regulating the meat industry, the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. Basically, these are laws overseeing, things that you consume, things that people consume, ensuring that they're safe and ensuring that they contain what the seller claims they contain. Muckraking. And then the environment. Probably what Roosevelt, besides his foreign policy and some other things, is most famous for is for his conservationism. Conservationism is basically environmental protection. Theodore Roosevelt was an avid hunter. He loved to hunt big game. He loved to be out in nature. He loved to he loved nature. And as the Industrial Revolution progressed, he became very concerned that this continuous growth in industry and this continuous march towards industrialization and producing things would end up ravaging nature, without regard to what was left behind. And he saw it firsthand with the coal miners, who would just destroy entire, mountains and mountainsides in order to get to the coal and destroy habitats, destroy animals. And so he truly believed that the land was a sacred trust. And so he made it his priority to preserve or conserve as much nature as possible for future generations. And he did this by protecting this land from industrial development. And mainly, the main way he did it was creating national forests. The national forests that were protected by the government from industrial or corporate exploitation. They may remain pristine. You can go out, very limited things that can be built on there. And you could go out and there'd be, you could be part of nature. And his argument was that, we get to enjoy these beautiful natural elements. Our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren should also be able to do this. So protected upwards of over 200 million acres, created 45 national forests. So the next time, and I hope you all get a chance to do this, next time you go to the Grand Canyon, or you go to Yellowstone National Park, or the Smoky Mountains, and it's beautiful and preserved, and there's not, oil rigs and other things there, you can thank Teddy Roosevelt, because it was a priority of his during his presidency. It's just a good picture of a meatpacking plant, meat processing. as you can see, the workers just stand in one spot, and the beef comes on a kind of like an assembly line, hanging from hooks, and your job basically is to just maybe cut off one part of the animal, and you do this, stand there for 10 hours with very sharp utensils. Bad things are likely to happen. You can cut your finger off, cut your arm off, whatever. It was dangerous. Now, Roosevelt chose not to run for re-election in 1908. He could have, but he chose not to. But he was so very popular, and so he knew that he could probably hand point his own successor, who would get reelected if he, promoted him and stood behind him. So he chose a man named William Howard Taft, who was a longtime supporter of progressive causes. He was a very capable administrator in the government. Maybe not the best person to be president, but he was capable, I guess. Of course, he had to win his election, and he ran against the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan. It's a progressive era, so both of their platforms are progressive. There's not a whole lot of difference between what they're wanting, so it becomes oftentimes somewhat of a personality contest or a partisan contest where you just pick the person that is a member of your political party. But Taft wins, defeats Bryan, but a third-party candidate ran. Of course, we talked about him in the past. Socialist Eugene V. Debs receives 421,000 votes, which is a very large amount of votes for a third-party candidate at that time. So Taft is president. One of the main things Taft wanted, and the Republicans wanted as well, was tariff reform. One of the progressive ideas of the time is lower tariffs, which makes things more less expensive for the consumer. Taft wanted lower tariffs, and he pushed lower tariffs. But when Congress finished with the tariff bill and Taft signed it, it lowered some tariffs, but it raised many tariffs. And that in itself angered many of his progressive supporters in the Republican Party. And then what happened later was that he would lose many of the rest of his progressive supporters, especially those that were still supportive of Roosevelt, with the Ballinger-Pinchot controversy. Mr. Pinchot, I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Pinchot was the chief of forestry that was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt. And he was still, of course, in that position when Taft became president. He goes public with accusations against the Secretary of Interior. His name is Ballinger. And Ballinger supposedly had been doing some under-the-table deals, taking bribes or something like that, and allowing people special access to federal land, public land, to drill for oil and other things. Well, Pinchot goes to Taft and tells him about this. Taft is president, so it's like he's going to go to his boss and tells him about Ballinger. Well, Taft kind of ignores him and says, okay, thanks for telling me, but Taft did nothing. And this angered Pinchot. So Pinchot goes public. And, of course, this is a violation, at least in Taft's mind, of his trust in Pinchot. So he's fired by Taft. And, of course, since Pinchot was a friend of Roosevelt's and was appointed by Roosevelt, this greatly angered Teddy Roosevelt. And so Taft lost more progressive support. And then the final Taft-Roosevelt break, Roosevelt tells Taft had betrayed progressivism, but in reality, Taft busted more trusts and was really in some ways more progressive than Roosevelt, but it was personal. He was just saying that because it was really personal, because he had fired one of Roosevelt's friends. So Roosevelt decided that he was going to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination, presidential nomination in 1912. So he was going to run for president against Taft as a Republican. As we mentioned before, you have these primary elections where within the party you choose a candidate to run for president. Well, it's Taft versus Roosevelt. And even though Roosevelt's very popular, Taft is still the sitting president. And it is very rare that a sitting president is rejected in in the primary by his own party, and Taft eventually wins. But that's not the end for Roosevelt. Roosevelt decides to go ahead and if he can't defeat Taft in the Republican primary, he'll run as a third-party candidate in the presidential election. So Roosevelt runs as a candidate for the Progressive Party, also called the Bull Moose Party, because after an attempted suicide attempt on Roosevelt, some reporters asked him if he's going to continue to run. He said, of course I am. I'm as fit as a bull moose. And so that kind of stuck. But so in the election of 1912, you're going to have a Republican candidate, William Howard Taft. You're going to have a Progressive Party candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, and you're going to have a Democratic candidate named Woodrow Wilson. That's William Howard Taft, obviously giving a political speech. He was a mediocre president, probably most famous for he was a very large man, as you can see, but he's probably most famous for getting stuck in the White House bathtub and having to be physically removed from it. Okay, so the election of 1912, as I mentioned, you had Roosevelt as the candidate for the Bull Moose Party. You had William Howard Taft as the Republican, and the Democrats chose a man named Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson has kind of interesting background. He grew up, his father was a preacher. He grew up in a very religious, rigid, strict household, and that really influenced him the rest of his life and how he viewed the world. He was very smart. He was an academic. He was president of Princeton University, and he later became governor of New Jersey. And so he runs for president against Taft and Roosevelt. And there's a common refrain about elections and wars as well, is divide and conquer. And kind of what, if you remember going back, if you taken History 1, in the election of 1860, one of the reasons Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election, is because the Democrats split, and they ran like 3 different candidates as different Democrats, and based on the issue of slavery. Well, same thing kind of happened here. There were many Republicans that supported Taft. There were many Republicans that supported Roosevelt. Well, they split the Republican vote, and it allowed Roosevelt to win. Probably if it had just been Taft, he might have won. If it had just been Roosevelt, he really likely would have lost. Wilson would. But anyway, Wilson, like Taft and Roosevelt before him, he was progressive, and because you are in the progressive era, so you did see proactive governmental policies to help try to solve some of the issues of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. There's a long list of things that progressive reforms under Wilson. Just kind of know for testing purposes that these things happened under Wilson's presidency. You don't have to know the deep specifics of them. Just kind of, for our purposes, know that they happened while Wilson was president. The Underwood-Simmons tariff, which basically lowered tariffs, which is a progressive idea. The 16th Amendment, which gave the federal government the power to tax income. One of the reasons that they felt like this was necessary is that the revenue streams that were traditional for the federal government were beginning to dry up. The 2 main ways in which the federal government or the national government would raise money in the past were through tariffs, which is taxing importers. Well, if you are promoting lower tariffs, then that means you're getting in less money. The other was selling of federal land. That was, the U.S. government always had tons of federal land that they had accumulated in the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican War, but over time that land was sold and became privatized, and there was much less of it to sell to fill the coffers of the government. So they had to find a new stream, so they decided to tax the labor of the workers. The Federal Reserve Act, 1913, created the Federal Reserve System, which is a permanent national bank in a lot of ways. If you remember, there was always those intense debates early in our nation's history first over the First National Bank, if you remember, between Jefferson and Hamilton arguing over whether we should establish a national bank, and then the Second National Bank, which led to the Andrew Jackson's war on the banks. But by 1913, the government was able to push through the Federal Reserve System, which created a Federal Reserve Bank that basically controlled the money supply of the U.S. economy. And it is a privately owned system that is owned by the banks themselves. And outside of while the president does appoint members of the Federal Reserve Board, the actual Federal Reserve is a private organization that controls the money supply of the United States. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 did more attempts to control monopolies, making it easier and expanding the ability to break up monopolies. The Federal Trade Commission is established as another mechanism to kind of regulate big businesses and ensure that all different parts of the country are, at least to an extent, being supplied fairly. But with all of these things, there were some reversals on social justice issues for Wilson. He was very unprogressive on race issues. While much of the progressive era was involved with urbanization and industrial revolution, there were still aspects of progressivism that were working for equality and equal rights for Black Americans. Wilson was not real supportive of this. That was one of his anti-progressive stances, I guess, if you will. Also, the Federal Highway Act, 1916, helped promote the expansion of a highway system. Of course, cars are becoming much more prevalent at this point. The Keating-Owen Act, which attempted to limit through a national law child labor. Of course, I believe, well, I'll just leave it at that, trying to implement child labor laws. And then the Adamson Act, an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. So these are basically laws trying to, progressive laws trying to limit the overreaching power of business and solving some of the issues of labor and of the regular people, trying to help them improve their lives to some extent. But progressivism had its limits. Black disenfranchisement, especially in the Deep South, continued. The South was still very successful in limiting the ability of their black citizens to participate in politics, to vote, or to even be able to access basic necessities of life because of segregation. Also, the idea of the scientific management led to faceless policymakers. Historically in a democracy, if policies are made and laws are implemented and they don't work, you can hold somebody accountable, that elected official. But now you have these commissions in the background that are making these policies. So it's kind of this transition to these faceless policymakers, or you didn't really know who to blame if something went wrong. And weirdly, one of the goals was to increase democratic participation with these, direct primaries and initiatives and things like that. Well, there's actually a decline in voter participation during the progressive era. So those were the limits. This is just a map of the Electoral College map. Now, just a reminder on the Electoral College. Basically, each state, in a presidential election, each state has a number of electoral votes. And that number equals the number of U.S. senators plus the number of House of Representative members that are in each state. So each state, of course, has 2 senators. And each state has at least 1 House of Representative member. So states like Wyoming and New Mexico and Arizona, as you see back then, Nevada, they have 3. That's the minimum, because you have at least 1 House member and 2 senators. But of course, the House of Representatives is based on population. How many you have in your representative seats in your state is based on, how many people you have. So the more you have, the more seats you have. So states with more population have more electoral votes because they have more House of Representative members. Now, in a presidential election, for the most part, with a few exceptions, like in California, with a few exceptions, if you win as a candidate for president, if you win the state, it doesn't matter how much you win it by. You could win it by 1 vote or 1,000,000 votes. If you win the state, you win all of the Electoral College votes. And so in the election of 1912, because the Republicans split their vote between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson was able to win a huge majority of the states, enough to get 435 electoral votes versus Teddy Roosevelt's 88 votes versus William Howard Taft's 8. But, so if you look at that, you say, okay, Woodrow Wilson got 435 and Roosevelt and Taft combined got 96. But look at the popular vote. Woodrow Wilson got 6,300,000. But if you combine the Teddy Roosevelt vote and the William Howard Taft vote, you got 7,600,000. So over 1,000,000 more votes went to Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, basically anti-Wilson votes. But Wilson won in a landslide in the Electoral College, and that goes back to the Electoral College and this idea of winner-take-all Electoral College.